You've been lied to about the Middle Ages. Schoolbooks gave you knights in shining armour, ladies weaving tapestries, monks copying manuscripts in silence. But here's the truth. Life was sweaty, stinking, and soaked in sex. And not the kind of sex you'd want to imagine. We're talking about things so filthy, so humiliating, and so bizarre that priests wrote whole lists of rules trying to stop them, only for people to invent even stranger ways of breaking them. Forget candlelight romances. Picture a one-room peasant hut where an entire family, parents, children, grandparents, livestock, all slept in the same space. Privacy? Zero. If a couple wanted to have sex, it happened with the sound of snoring kids and the stink of manure just a few feet away. And that was the normal kind. Because once you dig into the records, you find practices so dirty that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to write them down. Bathhouses were less about washing and more about sweating, drinking and rutting with strangers. Priests railed against them, calling them dens of sin, but people kept coming back. Why? Because for many that was the only time they could bathe, flirt and have sex in the same evening. Men and women bathed together, often naked, often drunk. And once the ale flowed, shame dissolved. The church might thunder about purity from the pulpit on Sunday, but Saturday night was another story. And then there's the confessional. Imagine kneeling to confess your sins, whispering what you did in the dark, only to realise the priest is listening a little too closely. Manuals for confessors included entire catalogues of sexual acts, not because the church approved, but because priests needed to know the details in order to ask the right questions, which meant the confessional booth became a kind of sexual archive, full of sins so bizarre that modern readers blush just reading them. The nobles weren't cleaner. In castles, lords and ladies indulged in affairs, orgies and courtly love that looked noble in poetry, but often meant exploiting servants in real life. Some kings were so notorious for their appetites that chroniclers described their bedrooms as revolving doors. For the poor, sex was about survival. For the rich, it was about power. And both could be equally filthy. And we can't forget the darkest corners, the ones polite historians avoid. Bestiality was a real crime, recorded in court records, punishable by death. Men caught with animals were burned with their partner. As grotesque as it sounds, it happened often enough that laws were written in gruesome detail. For peasants, living in close quarters with livestock blurred lines in ways we'd rather not think about. But the courts did, again and again. So before we go further, do me a favour. Hit like and subscribe, but only if this kind of history actually speaks to you. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It blows my mind how people all over the world drift off to sleep, listening to stories their teachers never dared to tell. Now dim the lights, pull the blanket closer, and brace yourself. Tonight we're not walking into a monastery or a knight's hall. We're walking straight into the bedroom, the brothel, and the bathhouse of the Middle Ages. And what you'll find there isn't chivalry, it's filth. If the Middle Ages had one constant drumbeat, it was the church's attempt to police the bedroom. From the pulpit to the confessional, priests warned that sex was dangerous, sinful, and, unless performed in the narrowest circumstances, a straight path to eternal damnation. But here's the paradox. The louder the church shouted about sin, the more people seemed obsessed with it. And the rules they came up with weren't just strict, they were bizarre, almost laughable, if they hadn't been enforced with such terrifying seriousness. Marriage itself was framed as a reluctant compromise. Augustine, one of Christianity's most influential voices, argued that sex was tainted by lust, no matter what. The only way to make it tolerable was within marriage, and even then, ideally only for the purpose of having children. Anything else was indulgence, and indulgence led to hell. The church didn't just police who you could have sex with, they policed how you could do it. Manuals for confessors listed forbidden positions, forbidden days, even forbidden hours. Missionary was preferred because anything else was seen as unnatural. Certain days of the week, Fridays, Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, were off limits. Put it all together, and if people had obeyed, there were only a few dozen permitted days a year left for sex. But of course, people didn't obey. Instead, these prohibitions turned sex into something secret, shameful, and, ironically, more exciting. Couples sneaked around rules using barns, fields, or dark corners. Priests thundered against adultery, but parish records are filled with cases of affairs. And the more restrictions the church piled on, the more inventive people became in breaking them. Confession became a strange theatre of desire. To root out sins, priests had to ask questions so explicit they practically read like pornography. Did you do it lying down, standing up, from behind, alone or with another? With your spouse or with someone else? With a man, a woman, or, God forbid, an animal? Each answer was a sin to be weighed and punished. And for some confessors, the booth wasn't just about forgiveness. It was an invitation to pry into the intimate lives of their flock. There are whispered accounts of priests taking advantage of this power, trading absolution for favours, or seducing parishioners who came for guidance. The obsession went beyond confessions. In some places, couples caught breaking the rules, faced public penance, flogged in the marketplace, forced to parade in shame, or made to wear ridiculous costumes that declared their sin. And yet, for every punishment, there were dozens of quiet transgressions that slipped through the cracks. Behind the heavy doors of cottages and castles alike, people continued doing exactly what the church feared most, whatever they wanted. The result was a society torn between outward piety and private indulgence. On one hand, sermons raged against lust as the root of all evil. On the other, medieval literature, even written by monks, bubbled with sexual jokes, bawdy poetry, and tales of clerics caught with their pants down. Desire was everywhere, even where it wasn't supposed to be. And that's the heart of the story. The church tried to strangle desire with rules, but in doing so, it only made the Middle Ages one of the most obsessed, filthy, and secretive eras of sexual history. Every whispered rule produced a whispered sin. Every prohibition gave birth to a darker temptation. If you strip away the myths of knights and ladies, the truth of medieval sex begins in the peasant hut. And here's the shocker. Most people in Europe lived like this, not in castles. Forget four-poster beds and silk sheets. Imagine a single smoky room where an entire family, parents, children, grandparents, maybe even a servant or two, slept shoulder to shoulder on straw, surrounded by chickens, pigs, and the smell of manure. Sex still happened there. It had to. There was no other place. Privacy didn't exist. If a husband wanted his wife, he pulled her closer under the same blanket, while their children pretended to be asleep just a few feet away. Sometimes the children weren't asleep, and that was simply part of life. Chroniclers describe boys and girls growing up with a front row seat to adult life, including its filthiest parts. Shockingly, this was seen less as scandal and more as just the way things were. The bed itself wasn't really a bed. At best, it was a rough mattress stuffed with straw, crawling with lice, fleas and bedbugs. Blankets were coarse wool that stank of sweat and damp. And yet in this space, couples made love. Not with soft candlelight, but with the glow of a smoky fire and the sound of pigs snuffling in the corner. For peasants, sex was both survival and shame. On one hand, children meant more workers for the fields. On the other, pregnancy could ruin a young girl's chance at marriage if she wasn't wed first. It was common for parents to chaperone daughters to prevent nighttime visits from eager boys, but young men were inventive. Stories circulate of boys sneaking into barns or climbing through windows, even of entire villages looking the other way when a couple disappeared into the hayloft. And then there's the filth no romance novel dares mention, the smell. Medieval people bathed rarely, sometimes only a few times a year. Sweat, unwashed hair, and the stench of smoke and livestock mixed with sex in ways that modern noses would find unbearable. But back then, that was simply desire's perfume. It wasn't just married couples. Adultery among peasants was common, despite harsh penalties. A woman caught with another man might be paraded through town in shame. A man could be fined, beaten, or worse, but records show it happened anyway, because in a world without privacy, temptation was everywhere. And perhaps the strangest reality, sex wasn't always between two people. In cramped huts where families slept together, it wasn't rare for siblings or servants to be involved, or at least exposed to it, in ways that blurred boundaries. Historians tread carefully here, but the documents speak. Cases of incest, of coercion, of blurred lines between consent and survival. These weren't fairy tales. They were ugly, raw, and far too common. So when you imagine medieval sex, don't think lace curtains and secret rendezvous. Think straw poking your back, fleas biting your skin, and the sound of a cow shifting in the shadows. This was the bed of the medieval peasant, and it was as dirty in smell and circumstance as it was in practice. When people imagine medieval Europe, they often picture filth, muddy streets, unwashed peasants, and years without a bath. But here's the twist. Public bathhouses actually flourished across much of the continent, especially from the 12th to 15th centuries. They were meant to provide hygiene, but quickly became something far more scandalous, dens of pleasure, temptation, and disease. At first, bathhouses weren't scandalous at all. They were seen as a continuation of Roman tradition. Men and women could go to hot baths, sometimes together, and it was perfectly ordinary to sit naked in steaming water. Families even visited as groups. Town councils often promoted baths, claiming they improved health and kept the community clean. But where bodies gathered unclothed, desire wasn't far behind. Imagine the scene. A wooden building, steam rising from tubs filled with warm water, heated by fires beneath the floor. Men and women lounged side by side, drinking ale and wine served by attendants. Music played. Some even brought food to eat while they soaked. It doesn't take much imagination to guess what happened once enough alcohol and naked skin mixed. By the 14th century, bathhouses had become infamous. Priests thundered from pulpits that these were not baths but brothels in disguise. Many were exactly that. Prostitutes worked openly inside, offering services between tubs or leading clients to private chambers upstairs. Chroniclers described bathhouses as houses of sin, where flesh boiled in more ways than one. But the filth was more than moral. Disease spread like wildfire. Bathwater was rarely changed. Dozens of bodies soaked in the same tub, sweating, drinking, spitting, sometimes urinating where they sat. The water became a soup of filth, and worse, bathhouses became hotspots for the plague. During outbreaks of Black Death, authorities shut them down, claiming the steam spread contagion. Yet as soon as the danger passed, they reopened. desire always triumphed over fear. For women, bathhouses were both opportunity and danger. A poor woman might find work as a washer or attendant only to be drawn into prostitution. A wealthy woman could visit for supposed health benefits, but risked her reputation if seen too often. Rumours spread quickly. A woman who bathed too much wasn't just clean, she was easy. And for men, the bathhouse was a place to shed, not just clothes, but social rules. Here, merchants and peasants sat together, drunk, naked and equal. Here, men sought both women and sometimes each other. The church kept records of confessions involving same-sex encounters in bathhouses, scandals too dirty to discuss in public, but too common to ignore. When we picture medieval sex, the bed often comes to mind. But in reality, many of the dirtiest, most shameless acts happened in these steaming rooms, where sweat, wine and flesh mingled until no one pretended it was about hygiene anymore. If there was one place in medieval life where sex and sin collided most nakedly, it wasn't in the bed or the bathhouse, it was in the church. More specifically, in the confessional. What was meant to be the holiest exchange between sinner and priest became in practice one of the filthiest windows into medieval sexuality. Confession was compulsory. People had to tell their priest everything, every slip of the tongue, every impure thought, every dirty act behind closed doors. But here's the twist, priests weren't just listening. They had manuals, thick handbooks, that spelled out every possible sin a human body could commit. And these weren't vague guidelines, they read like encyclopedias of filth. Imagine kneeling before a priest whispering that you'd been unfaithful. He wouldn't let you stop there. He'd press with whom? Was it man or woman? Did you lie down or stand up? Was it the natural way or something forbidden? Was it alone, with your spouse, with more than one person, with something not human? The interrogation went on until every detail was dragged out, because only then could the priest assign proper penance. And here's where it gets darker. Some confessors took pleasure in these details. Stories circulated of priests growing aroused during confession, lingering too long on forbidden acts, or hinting at absolution in exchange for more than words. For vulnerable women especially, the booth could turn from a place of forgiveness into a place of exploitation. The manuals themselves reveal a society obsessed with sex. One from the 13th century spends pages describing every possible variation of unnatural intercourse, from same-sex acts to bestiality, from adultery to incest, and even bizarre superstitions about demons visiting people in their sleep. These texts were supposed to help priests prevent sin, but in practice they preserved the dirtiest secrets of the Middle Ages in writing. For ordinary people, confession was humiliating. Imagine telling a celibate man every time you touched yourself, or admitting that you'd fumbled with a neighbour in the hayloft. And yet, they did, because not confessing was worse. Refusing to reveal your sins meant eternal damnation. So men and women spoke, blushing, sweating, sometimes weeping, while their priests scribbled notes or nodded with practiced detachment. But not every priest was detached. In village after village, scandals erupted. Priests accused of seducing parishioners, sometimes under the guise of penitential correction. Nuns confessing to priests, only to fall into affairs. Widows who turned confession into flirtation. These weren't isolated tales, they appear again and again in chronicles, court records and whispered rumours. The confessional was supposed to cleanse the soul. Instead it became a theatre of shame, a stage where the dirtiest sexual practices of the Middle Ages were not only revealed but in some cases perpetuated. It was both archive and breeding ground for the very sins it claimed to fight. If peasants had their filth in smoky huts and straw beds, nobles had theirs in gilded chambers. But don't let the silk sheets and perfumed oils fool you. Medieval aristocrats indulged in practices so scandalous that chroniclers either softened them with poetry or hid them completely. And when the truth did slip out, it read more like pornography than history. Courtly love, that delicate game of knights serenading ladies, is often painted as pure romance. In reality, it was frequently the opposite, a ritualised excuse for adultery. Lords and ladies traded love poems, secret tokens, and stolen kisses that often led to far more than whispers in gardens. Troubadour songs celebrated longing, but behind castle walls they celebrated lust. Castles weren't just fortresses, they were playgrounds. Servants were vulnerable, and nobles knew it. A lady's maid could be pressured into a lord's bed. A young squire might find himself the object of his lady's desires. And because power protected them, nobles often acted with impunity. Scandals erupted when illegitimate children appeared, half servant, half noble, proof of what everyone already suspected. Orgies weren't unheard of either. Chronicles describe feasts where wine flowed endlessly, clothes came off, and inhibitions vanished. These weren't publicised, of course, but whispers spread. One bishop wrote with horror about tables of sin, where nobles lay with multiple partners in the same room, laughing as if it were sport. Incest crept into these stories as well. Noble families, desperate to preserve bloodlines, often married cousins, sometimes closer. Behind the rhetoric of piety, beds saw unions that blurred the line between kinship and lust. And when the church did try to step in, wealthy families bribed or begged their way to papal dispensations, which legalised what would have been scandalous for anyone else. And yet, the dirtiest part was how public it all could be. A servant walking past a half-open door might see their lord with someone who wasn't his wife. Gossip spread through kitchens and stables, carried down to the village, where peasants laughed bitterly at the hypocrisy. Nobles preached virtue in public, but wallowed in filth in private. Even kings weren't immune. Some monarchs were so brazen that their sexual excesses became legend. Chronicles describe kings with harems of mistresses, chambers built for pleasure, and obsessions that shocked even their courtiers. These weren't just rumours, they were scandals that shook entire kingdoms, shaping politics as much as pleasure. So if you imagine noble bedrooms filled with candlelit romance, think again. They were stages for some of the dirtiest sexual practices of the Middle Ages, only draped in silk instead of straw. If there's one dirty truth about the Middle Ages that historians often whisper about but rarely dwell on, it's this. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was regulated, taxed, and in some places encouraged. Priests railed against it in sermons, but city officials quietly counted on brothels to keep men satisfied and to line municipal coffers with coin. The logic was simple, at least to medieval minds. Better, they argued, for men to pay a prostitute than to seduce someone's wife, daughter, or servant. The brothel became a safety valve, a grim compromise between moral outrage and social reality. St. Augustine himself once wrote that without prostitutes, society would collapse into chaos. That single idea gave birth to centuries of hypocrisy, condemning women as sinners while keeping their services legal. Step inside one of these places and you'd quickly lose any romantic illusions. Forget silk curtains or scented oils. Medieval brothels were often filthy wooden shacks near rivers, chosen so waste could be dumped straight into the water. Inside, straw mattresses reeked of sweat and disease. Rats scurried in corners. The women themselves, some forced, some desperate, some seeking survival, worked long hours for little pay, their bodies worn down by endless clients and untreated infections. The church called them daughters of Eve, symbols of temptation. Town councils, meanwhile, taxed them heavily, treating women's bodies as revenue streams. In some places, prostitutes were required to wear special clothing, red hoods, striped shawls or bells, marking them publicly as women of shame. Imagine walking through town, unable to hide who you were, everyone knowing your trade. For men, visiting a brothel carried its own risks. Aside from the shame of being caught, venereal diseases, especially syphilis by the late Middle Ages, spread rapidly. Chronicles describe men with grotesque sores, their sins visible on their bodies for everyone to see. Yet still they went, because desire outweighed fear. And here's the darker layer. Not all prostitutes were there by choice. Many were sold by families too poor to feed them. Others were orphans who had nowhere else to go. Some were literally forced into the trade by city officials who saw it as more useful than letting women beg on the streets. It was a brutal economy where women's bodies became municipal property. For all the filth and tragedy, brothels were also places of gossip, scandal, and sometimes politics. Powerful men visited in disguise. Affairs began or ended in their chambers, and occasionally prostitutes themselves became key figures in trials or conspiracies, holding secrets that could topple reputations. So when people call prostitution in the Middle Ages a necessary evil, they mean it literally, an institution so dirty, so hypocritical, that it survived for centuries, precisely because society wanted it both hidden and essential. Priests in the Middle Ages were supposed to embody chastity, sworn to celibacy, models of restraint, guardians of souls. But the reality was far uglier. Behind church walls, desire crept in, and when it did, it turned holy men into some of the most notorious participants in the dirtiest sexual practices of the age. Despite their vows, countless clerics lived openly with mistresses. In some towns, it was so common that people joked about priests' wives. These women weren't wives at all, of course, but long-term lovers, sometimes even publicly acknowledged. The church tried to crack down, issuing strict bans, threatening punishments, but the scandals never stopped. Priests fathered illegitimate children everywhere, and entire villages knew which boy looked suspiciously like the man who preached chastity on Sundays. Worse still were the abuses of power. Parishioners came to priests for confession, for advice, for spiritual comfort. Instead, some found themselves pressured into sexual favours. Chronicles tell of young widows seduced under the pretense of spiritual guidance, of poor women convinced that a priest's touch could absolve their sins. The hypocrisy was staggering. Men who damned prostitutes from the pulpit only to visit them after dark. Men who condemned lust only to indulge it in secret. Monasteries, too, weren't immune. Far from being bastions of holy devotion, many were hotbeds of scandal. Accounts speak of monks caught in affairs with nuns, of drunken feasts inside cloisters, of brothels operating practically under abbey walls. Some abbots grew rich from the very vices they condemned, taxing prostitutes while sneaking through side doors to enjoy their services. And then there were darker whispers about relationships between priests and boys entrusted to their care. These stories, too dirty for many chroniclers to detail, lurked in the margins of records, reminders that abuse of power often left the most vulnerable scarred, the dirtiest irony. The same men who fell into these sins were the ones tasked with punishing others for them. A villager caught with a lover might face penance or public shaming, delivered by a priest who, hours earlier, had been with his own mistress. The gap between law and practice was wide, and it reeked of hypocrisy. By the late Middle Ages, the corruption grew so notorious that reformers began calling priests wolves among the flock. Yet the system endured, because to challenge clerical power was to challenge the very structure of society. The lust of priests remained one of the filthiest open secrets of the era. Whispered about in taverns, laughed about in marketplaces, but rarely written down in full. If you thought medieval sex was already dirty enough, this is where the filth crosses into territory so shameful that even chroniclers often wrote with trembling hands. One of the darkest accusations of the Middle Ages was bestiality. Humans caught with animals. Today it sounds absurd, a grotesque rumour whispered for shock. But in medieval Europe, it was treated as deadly serious and deadly punishable. Animals weren't just livestock. They shared the homes, barns, and even beds of peasants. Families slept under the same roof, with pigs, goats, chickens, and dogs because warmth mattered more than propriety. In that cramped intimacy, temptation, and desperation sometimes blurred into behaviour that horrified both neighbours and priests. Court records from France, England, and Germany detail shocking cases. A farm boy caught with a sheep might be dragged before a judge. A maid accused of laying with a dog could be condemned not only herself, but see the animal executed too, burned, hanged, or drowned, as if the beast were equally guilty. It sounds insane now, but to medieval minds, the animal was a participant in the sin and had to be destroyed. Punishments were brutal. Men accused of bestiality were often sentenced to death, usually by burning alive, a fiery cleansing of the sin. Women too were executed, sometimes alongside the animal itself. Chroniclers described villagers watching in horror as goats or cows were led to the pyre next to their owners, a grotesque spectacle of moral justice. And yet, the sheer number of cases preserved suggests this wasn't rare. Was every accusation true? Probably not. Sometimes bestiality charges were political, a way to smear an enemy or humiliate a rival. But enough cases exist to suggest it happened far more often than polite history admits. The church obsessed over these sins in confession manuals. Priests were told to ask about them explicitly. They listed them alongside incest, adultery, and sodomy as the dirtiest corruptions of human flesh. Manuals even ranked sins by severity, with bestiality placed among the vilest. What's disturbing is how openly villagers would discuss it when someone was caught. Trials became public entertainment. People gathered in squares to watch the condemned suffer, to laugh bitterly, to whisper about the details. It was horror mixed with spectacle, punishment as theatre, sin turned into public shame. Behind all this was a darker truth. Peasants lived in such close, filthy quarters with animals that the line between necessity and taboo blurred. Sleeping in the same bed with goats wasn't unusual. Washing next to pigs wasn't unusual. And in a world where privacy didn't exist, temptations grew in ways modern minds can barely process. So when we talk about the dirtiest sexual practices of the Middle Ages, bestiality wasn't just whispered about. It was written down, punished, and displayed. It was a stain so shameful that medieval society made sure everyone knew the price of it. Not just your body, but the life of the animal beside you. By the late Middle Ages, one of the dirtiest intersections of sexuality and fear came not from brothels or nobles' chambers, but from accusations of witchcraft. The witch hunts that swept across Europe weren't only about sorcery, they were about sex, and the stories told in courtrooms and under torture revealed some of the most grotesque, shame-filled fantasies ever recorded. Priests and inquisitors believed, or claimed to believe, that women accused of witchcraft lay with demons and even the devil himself. Manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum described in lurid detail how witches supposedly surrendered their bodies to incubi, male demons, or offered themselves to Satan in midnight rituals. These weren't vague accusations. They described positions, acts, even the physical feel of demonic lovers. Torture fueled these confessions. Women were stretched on racks, crushed with weights, or burned with irons until they admitted to sexual congress with the devil. Under agony, they spoke of grotesque unions, demons with cold flesh, foul breath, and seed that burned like fire. Some claimed they were forced, nightly, into obscene acts, their bodies no longer their own. The church insisted this was proof of women's weakness, their tendency to sin through flesh. But many modern historians see something else: projection. Priests obsessed with sex, repressing their own desires, poured them into these accusations. The result was a medieval pornography of fear, written in court records and trial transcripts. And the accusations didn't stop with demons. Women were accused of orgies at witches' sabbaths, of copulating with animals under Satan's command, of luring men into unholy unions. One trial in 15th century Germany records a woman confessing that she had lain with the goat who was really the devil in disguise, a confession ripped from her through screams. For men accused of witchcraft, the charges were just as filthy. They were accused of sodomy with demons, of wasting their seed in unholy ways, of castrating others through magic. Sex became a weapon, the ultimate tool to paint the accused as vile beyond redemption. The most disturbing part: villagers believed it. Gossip spread about women flying to Sabbaths not only to cast curses, but to indulge in mass orgies. Neighbours whispered about the widow who lived alone, the healer who touched too many bodies, the woman who seemed too independent. Lust and suspicion went hand in hand. What began as superstition became a systematic obsession with sex, a way to demonise women and satisfy hidden cravings for scandal. When the flames consumed witches in village squares, people told themselves it was about saving souls. But the records show something filthier, a society both terrified of and addicted to its own sexual nightmares. Medieval medicine was a strange blend of scripture, superstition, and half-remembered fragments of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge. Doctors, many of them trained in universities run by the church, spoke with authority, but often their remedies sounded more like erotic superstition than actual healing. And when it came to women's health, the filth ran deepest. One of the most persistent medieval beliefs was that women's wombs were unstable, prone to wandering around inside the body. If the womb moved too far up, it might cause choking. If it wandered down, paralysis. The cure: stimulation. Physicians argued that women needed regular sexual release to keep the womb anchored. In other words, female orgasm was prescribed like medicine. But here's where it gets disturbing. Doctors often framed women as naturally insatiable, prone to hysteria if they didn't find satisfaction. Midwives and even male physicians would sometimes treat these conditions with hands-on intervention. Some records describe it clinically, as if it were no different than setting a bone. But the reality is obvious. Women's bodies became tools for medicalized lust. There were even herbal guides that recommended aphrodisiacs not to spice up marriages, but to restore health. Potions with honey, wine, and crushed roots were sold to increase a woman's heat. On the darker side, charms and prayers were combined with invasive rituals, where the line between healing and violation blurred to nothing. And then came the lewd myths about male semen. Medieval texts insisted it was a life-giving fluid, not only for creating children, but also for curing female ailments. Doctors argued that women who went too long without receiving it risked illness. Melancholy of the womb, they called it. Unsurprisingly, this diagnosis conveniently justified male desire, cloaking it as medical necessity. Diseases, too, were misunderstood in grotesque ways. Syphilis, which ravaged Europe later in the Middle Ages, was often blamed on excess lust or unclean women. Treatments included smearing mercury ointments on sores, sometimes even inside the genitals, an agony worse than the disease. Others suggested bloodletting near the groin to balance humours, leaving patients weak, infected, and often closer to death. What's most revealing is how these medical ideas reinforced sexual double standards. Men were told their desires were natural, even healthy. Women, on the other hand, were treated as dangerously lustful and in constant need of control. Their sexuality was at once demonized and exploited, a paradox written into medical texts, enforced by priests and carried out by so-called healers. Looking back, it's hard not to see medieval medicine as a strange pornography of its own, obsessed with genitals, constantly framing health in terms of sex, and always finding ways to blur healing with gratification. Medieval justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about spectacle. And that spectacle often carried a heavy dose of sexual humiliation. When someone was accused of lustful sins, adultery, sodomy, prostitution, or unnatural acts, the punishment was designed not just to hurt, but to shame their bodies in front of everyone. Take the drunkard's cloak, for example. Officially it was for disorderly behaviour, but sexual offenders were sometimes forced into similar humiliations. Imagine being paraded through town in rags, a placard announcing your crime, crowds jeering and throwing filth at you. For women accused of adultery, shaved heads were common, stripping them not only of beauty, but of dignity. The act turned the body itself into a warning. Prostitutes who broke rules could be flogged publicly, barebacked in the square. Some were forced to ride backward on donkeys, a symbol of disgrace. Others had hot irons pressed to their flesh, branding them forever as women of sin. The crowd didn't just watch, they laughed, jeered, sometimes even joined in the cruelty, pelting stones or rotten food. Men weren't spared either. Those caught in sodomy could face brutal executions, but before the end came, their bodies were often exposed, paraded, and mocked. One chronicler describes a man marched naked through a village, with a noose around his neck, his unnatural shame announced by a crier. The humiliation was as important as the execution, perhaps even more so. Inquisitors believed shame cured sin. They saw the public body as a tool, strip it, expose it, humiliate it, and the crowd would learn what not to do. But behind that ideology lurked something filthier: voyeurism. Medieval crowds weren't just horrified, they were fascinated. Public punishments became entertainment, mixing sex, violence, and spectacle into one. Even marital punishments existed. Husbands accused of beating wives too severely were sometimes humiliated by being forced to ride donkeys while holding kitchen tools, mocked for acting like women. Wives accused of adultery might be forced to walk barefoot through towns in only their undergarments, their bodies turned into moral billboards. The dirtiest irony, the same society that condemned lust and indecency was addicted to watching it play out in public punishments. The scaffold and the square became theatres of filth, where shame and desire blurred. Of all the sexual fixations of the medieval world, none was as intense or as hypocritical as the obsession with virginity. To society, a woman's worth wasn't her mind, her skill, or her spirit. It was her body, specifically whether it had ever been touched. Virginity was prized like gold, guarded like treasure, and tested in ways that today feel degrading, filthy, and absurd. Fathers arranged marriages based on the assumption their daughters were pure. A virgin bride meant honour for the family, legitimacy for heirs, and financial advantage in the dowry negotiations. Lose that, and everything collapsed. But how to prove purity? That's where the dirtiest practices emerged. In some places, midwives were tasked with examining brides to confirm they were untouched. Imagine being paraded before strangers, your body reduced to evidence in a transaction between men. Chronicles describe humiliating virginity tests that involved crude physical inspection or superstitious signs, like whether a woman blushed when questioned. The results, of course, were unreliable, but the shame was real, and then came the ritual of the wedding night. Families sometimes demanded proof of consummation. Blood-stained sheets were displayed as evidence of virginity, properly surrendered. If the bride failed to bleed, suspicion erupted. Accusations of infidelity, annulments, even violence, the pressure turned what should have been private into a public trial. The church fed the obsession. Virgin martyrs were glorified in sermons, their bodies celebrated as sacred, precisely because they had never known touch. The Virgin Mary herself was elevated as the ultimate model, impossible to emulate but used as a stick to beat women with. Desire was seen as a stain, and virginity as the only way to resist it. For widows or unmarried women, the stigma was crushing. A woman past a certain age who wasn't married or wasn't clearly a virgin could be cast as suspicious, labelled a prostitute, a witch, or simply fallen. The lines between purity and filth were drawn harshly, and women were trapped in between. The irony? While women were shamed and tested, men faced no such scrutiny. A groom's virginity was irrelevant. In fact, a man with experience was often praised. The double standard was glaring and filthy in its hypocrisy. Virginity was currency, obsession, and weapon. It turned women's bodies into battlegrounds for honour and control. And the medieval fixation left scars that lasted far beyond the age itself, shaping cultural attitudes about sex and purity for centuries to come. If medieval life seemed endlessly restricted by priests, rules and punishments, there were moments in the year when the lid blew off, and all that suppressed desire came roaring out. Festivals, carnivals and fairs weren't just about dancing and music. They were licensed explosions of chaos where lust, filth and shamelessness spilled into the open. Take Carnival itself, the weeks before Lent. In theory, it was a time of indulgence before fasting and prayer. In reality, it was a free-for-all. Men and women disguised in masks roamed the streets, anonymity giving cover for things they'd never dare do in daylight. Drunken orgies broke out in taverns, public groping spilled into alleys, and respectable townsfolk turned into animals for a few days. Chroniclers complained of lewdness in the streets, but they kept writing about it, perhaps because they couldn't look away. Fairs were no better. Markets brought strangers from miles around, and with them came prostitutes, entertainers, and pickpockets. In the chaos, lust thrived. Foreign women set up tents, offering their bodies as part of the festivities. Jugglers and actors told obscene jokes, mocking priests, mocking kings, mocking chastity itself. For peasants who spent most of the year under constant surveillance, these moments were intoxicating and filthy. Then there were charivari, rough village celebrations where newlyweds were mocked, often through obscene songs and pantomimes. If an old man married a young bride, villagers paraded with pots and pans, banging and singing about impotence and lust. The cruelty was wrapped in laughter, but it turned private sexuality into public shame, with everyone watching. Masks played a special role in these carnivals. Hidden faces allowed people to flirt across class lines, to indulge forbidden desires, even to mock authority without consequence. Monks put on women's clothes, women dressed as men, and for a night or two, the strict order of gender and morality collapsed. But beneath the laughter lay filth. Chroniclers recorded indecent coupling in doorways, drunken mobs urinating on churches, even stories of bestiality slipping into festivals under cover of darkness. What society condemned so harshly most of the year seemed to burst free in these brief windows. And the church, despite raging against it, tolerated carnival, perhaps knowing that without this release, the people might explode in worse rebellion. The paradox is clear. The same society that burned people for sodomy or adultery spent days every year indulging in sexual anarchy. Carnival wasn't just a party. It was a mirror, showing how desperate people were to escape the suffocating grip of moral law, if only for a night. If medieval punishments, brothels and carnivals showed the dirty side of public life, then the folklore, the whispered jokes, bawdy tales and obscene ballads showed what people really thought behind closed doors. These weren't the polished romances of knights and maidens written by court poets. These were the crude stories peasants told by the fire, the verses monks scribbled in margins, the jokes travellers carried from tavern to tavern. And they reveal a Middle Ages that was far filthier than the official histories admit. Take fabliaux, short comic tales written in France during the 12th and 13th centuries. These stories were obsessed with sex and trickery. Priests caught bedding their parishioners, wives cheating on clueless husbands, monks seducing maidens under the guise of holy duties. In one famous fabliau, a husband spies on his wife and her lover, only to fall into the privy and emerge covered in filth while the crowd laughs. The moral? Everyone's dirty, literally and figuratively. Songs were no better. Some medieval ballads sang not of chivalry, but of lust. German students in the Carmina Burana collection wrote verses about drunken sex, prostitutes, and even bestiality. One line boasts about coupling with girls in every tavern, while another describes a priest caught between the legs of a nun. These were the anthems of youth, bawdy, mocking, and defiantly obscene. Even saints' legends were twisted. Villagers told parodies of holy tales, where martyrs weren't resisting lust but succumbing to it. And a virgin saint might be recast in folk memory as the one who secretly took lovers before her death. These blasphemous versions weren't written down often, but church councils complained of them, proof they spread like wildfire among the common people. And then there were jokes. Medieval humour often turned on sex, bodily functions and shame. Priests were favourite targets, mocked as lechers who preached chastity by day and broke it by night. Widows were ridiculed as lustful, eager for young lovers. Even kings weren't safe. Chroniclers slipped in obscene anecdotes, barely disguised, about rulers too weak in bed or too obsessed with carnal sin. What's fascinating is how these filthy stories acted as a release valve. Officially, the church thundered against lust, sodomy, adultery, and obscenity. But in taverns and cottages, people laughed at those very sins. Humour gave them power. By mocking priests, kings, and even God's saints, they created a secret world where the shame of sex turned into laughter. Of course, laughter could also be cruel. Women were often the butt of the dirtiest jokes. Painted as insatiable, sneaky, and untrustworthy, men, too, were mocked for impotence or foolishness in bed. The tales weren't equal. They reinforced stereotypes even as they broke taboos. Still, these obscene legends show us the truest face of medieval sexuality. Not the sermons, not the laws, but the jokes whispered in shadows. It was filthy, funny, cruel, and strangely liberating. And it proves one thing. No matter how hard society tried to bury lust under rules and punishments, the dirty stories always found their way to the surface.